another story of the same. We're having a good time. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another episode of the Baltimore Bureau Podcast. We are today without our wonderful friend Dharna Noor, who is in New York for the Left. What's it called?
Left Forum, I believe.
Forum.
Yes.
Left Forum. Shout out to all the people doing that. I'm Eze Jackson with my good friend Baynard Woods here.
What's up, y'all?
If you're listening today, you are probably, like many of us, in the middle of a week or ending a week of celebrity drama, Roseanne Barr, Drake, Pusha T, Trump pardoning people. We will not be doing any of those stories.
I do want to say, though, as we were just talking about, I was shocked. If you're Baltimore people, you might have been too. It's spelled totally differently. But if your mind's where mine is, you see Trump pardons D'Souza, and you're like, holy fuck. What's going on? The police commissioner already? Like, I mean, I could see Trump pardoning Wayne Jenkins. Like, they're real similar, and Jenkins is white, too.
Right.
But D'Souza's like, but it's tax shit, and Trump has a vested interest in pardoning someone on tax shit. But no, it is the racist pundit and dickhead dirtbag pundit that he pardoned instead.
Yeah. So it is a weird week, and if you're feeling like it's been a weird week, you're not alone. But we have some dope stories to go through this week.
Yeah, we do. And one of the things that's been happening every week, I mean, every week's a weird week now. It's hard to, I mean, Jesus, between the weather or the, you know, the politics, every single thing every week is just constant state of insanity. Yeah. You know, and one thing that we'll talk about in a little bit, you know, to the people in Southwest Baltimore, people in Ellicott City, people who over the last weekend lost a bunch of shit, where shout out to y'all. And Dharna Noor wrote a great story about that on the site. She's not here to talk about it, but check it out. It really, and our friend Max Robinson, an old city paper writer who I knew from there, was one of the people caught up in that and swept away. So much love and grim solidarity to Max.
Yeah, much love to everybody out in Ellicott City, Howard County.
It's crazy. It's a fucking town that's facing an existential crisis. Do we come back and rebuild? I mean, that's a huge story beyond this region, because it's
they just rebuilt just a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, 2016, they had this massive flood come through. And they call them once in 1,000-year storms. Well, obviously, if you have it twice in 2 years, that's a once-a-year storm, yo. We've had 9,000-year storms in the last 10 years, so almost a once-a-year storm.
Yeah, for real.
But one thing that's been happening every week, and we're fortunate to have Eddie Conway going up and covering it every week, is the Poor People's Campaign. People have been having direct action, civil disobedience every single week, not only here, but in 30 different states and in the District of Columbia. And it's poor people trying to follow Martin Luther King's final campaign 50 years ago now, the Poor People's March, and trying to do that you know, now I mean, because the wealth disparity has increased by so much since then. So we have Eddie and up in Annapolis reporting on this.
Welcome to the Real News. I'm Eddie Conway, coming to you from Annapolis in front of the State House. This is the third week of the Poor People's Campaign. And once again, people have marched along a pathway, and they're now having a rally here. And it's anticipated there'll be some civil disobedience and perhaps some people going to jail.
We demand an end to military aggression and warmongering.
Yes.
We demand a stop to the privatization of the military budget and any increase in military spending.
Yes.
We demand a strong veteran system that remains public.
Yes.
We demand a ban on assault rifles and a ban on easy access to firearms.
Yes.
We demand the demilitarization of our communities on the border and in the interior.
Yes.
We demand an end to federal programs that send military equipment to local and state communities.
Yes.
We demand that the call to build a wall at the United States and Mexico border be ceased.
Yes.
We demand an immigration system that instead of criminalizing people for trying to raise their families, prioritize family reunification, keep families together, and allows us all to build thriving communities in the country we call home.
Thank you.
When we took our oath of enlistment, we swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Also to obey the orders of the President of the United States and officers appointed over me. Well, if I was still serving today, I'd have a problem following 45's orders. America's discretionary budget is about $1 trillion, with more than half going towards the military spending and the VA. One of the fundamental principles of the Poor People's Campaign is to transform the war economy into a peace economy that values all humanity.
Yes.
Yeah.
The war economy and militarization is so destructive that taking life and limb is not enough for soldiers. That's not enough. Now the war machine wants to control your mind by making you believe that kneeling during the national anthem is disrespectful to the flag and our veterans. Well, as a Vietnam veteran, I find that appalling.
One of the things I have to say is that I was involved with the first March on Washington, the Poor People's Campaign that took place in 1968. I helped prefab the housing for Resurrection City. And in fact, I understood back then that our government was wasting our tax dollars on the war in Vietnam, while at the same time making the claim that they did not have money to address the needs of poor people here inside the United States. And I felt that Dr. King was very correct in pointing out that, in saying that, in fact, that the war budget economy of the United States is a direct threat to addressing the needs of poor people in this country. In fact, he brought up the point that every year the military budget grew while the war on poverty budget shrank. And so that is just as true back in 1968 as it is today.
Martin Luther King, the 1968 Poor People Campaign, but that galvanized in D.C., even though it was muddy and wet, right?
Big time.
They came for jobs, bread, food, civil rights, etc. And some of them got on buses, some of them walked. You know the story. I don't have to tell you the story,
there.
Right? You were there. So what galvanized them was not the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was very important, but what galvanized them was their basic survival needs.
Yes.
And this, I guess what I'm seeing is this message is over their heads. It's real, and it is the message that they have to learn, and it is the lever in which they will have to press in order to make changes. But what moves them,
And I think that's one of the big weak points right now this group has. This group tends at this stage of the game not to really focus on that part of the community that are most adversely affected by the very policies that they're complaining about. And I think there is a need for more outreach, more going to those communities. The unfortunate thing is, you and I, as we were growing up, we spent most of our time in those very communities, in the organizations we were involved in. Many of the young people today that takes the leadership in this organization here, I don't believe are spending that much time in those communities and feel very uncomfortable in going into those very communities that we used to sell newspapers in, and we used to talk to people and talk about these issues. I don't think that the message is bad. I think the fact is that if people can't hear the message because you're not bringing it to them, then you're not going to get them involved. I think the message is on point.
It is.
But
it is.
we have to take the message to them. And I find that this is a weakness, is that I strongly believe that they should spend much more time in doing political education. They're operating from a perspective of top down. rather than from bottom up. And until that happens, we're going to have a weakness in this movement. This movement really needs to spend more time listening before they even start talking.
For the astute viewer, if you're on the podcast, you're kind of screwed if you're listening. But if you're a viewer of this, and if you're listening and you don't know, we also have the Baltimore Bureau podcast show, which is exactly the same thing, but you can see us sitting here talking. Something on the set has changed since the last segment. If you write me an email at baynard@therealnews.com, you'll get a Real News t-shirt if you tell me what it is.
So Baynard, you, of course, you always do a great job of covering police corruption, police reform, and stuff like that. This next piece on police reform, tell me, what's this about? Yeah, so this guy, Alex Vitale, has a book called The End of Policing, and it really uses end in that double sense, as in like the finish of, and ends and means. What is the purpose of policing? What's its goal? And it's a really interesting book where he looks at a number of different, he basically says that police reform is a lot like education reform as we use it now, which is really a way to just sort of corporatize it more. And the way that education reform is what DeVos talks about and stuff. And it's a way to maintain the validity of police by giving them more money and more areas that police are the first ones responsible for. So he's against all of the sort of body cam and stuff reform movements. And he's like, what we really need to do is reform society in ways. And so he has a list of about 8 different areas, from mental health to the drug culture to sex work, homelessness, and all of these areas that police are dealing with instead of us having social services dealing with, and that police can't deal with those. But he also goes back and shows that there's a long history, starting with the beginning of police in the 1700s in Charleston, South Carolina. Urban is, which I'd known that the slave patrols are one of the origins of police, but especially in cities was where, and then that it went from there to England, and that the guy who started the police force in England had been in charge of the colonial occupation of Ireland and used those kind of techniques. So he goes into a history of policing and also like why what we talk about as police reform is sort of failed. And this is the first of a 2-part interview. You can check out the second one will be up later on today. But yeah, I talked to him about all of this stuff. Cool. For the Real News in Baltimore, I'm Baynard Woods. We've been going through a wide-ranging series of problems with policing in the city over the last several years. Just in the last week or two, we've seen a number of officers convicted and starting to be sentenced in the Gun Trace Task Force trial. Going back, we had the uprising after the death of Freddie Gray, and we had a commissioner just last week be forced to resign only about a couple months into the job. Everyone here seems to be screaming for police reform in some way or another. But with me today is Alex Vitale, a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, who has a great new book out, The End of Policing, and it questions this whole narrative and this call for police reform. So welcome, Alex.
Thank you.
So what's the problem with these various calls for police reform that seem so well-intentioned when we know around the country that policing isn't a crisis? But you really question some of the reformers and the calls for reform. What's the problem with it?
Well, I think we have to understand the nature of policing and the ways in which the reforms that are most popular, and I'm thinking here a lot of the things that are included in these consent decrees or that are contained in Obama's Task Force on Policing report, they sort of misunderstand the nature of policing and its impact on communities. And so a lot of what they do is try to reestablish the legitimacy and the functionality and professionalism of policing without interrogating the kind of mission that the police have been given. So I always say a totally lawful, professional, unbiased, low-level drug arrest is still fundamentally unjust and serves no positive social purpose. And so just making the police more professional, having them follow the training better, adding some diversity to the police department doesn't change why it is we've come to rely on police to deal with such a huge range of problems in our communities.
Yeah, I want to go into some of those areas that you talk about policing really expanding. But I mean, the title of the book, as you were just talking about the real purpose of policing, the title is The End of Policing, and it's both a call in some ways, I think, for the end of it, but it's also addressing the ends, the purposes. And so what's the fundamental purpose of policing that you see? And you trace it all the way back to the beginning in Charleston with the slave patrols, and then in England, Boston. How did this begin, and what is the purpose of policing?
You know, we often get this liberal narrative of policing. You know, when I studied policing in school, you hear about the creation of the London Metropolitan Police in 1829 as the beginning of modern, professional, law enforcement-oriented policing. But what people often leave out of that story is, where did that idea come from? The police in London were created by Sir Robert Peel, Robert, Bob, the Bobbies. But no one talks about what job it is that he had before that, where he develops this idea. He was in charge of the colonial occupation of Ireland. And during that occupation, he had to manage the rural uprisings against English colonial rule that was incredibly exploitative and at times brutal and repressive. And policing was a way for him to more efficiently manage those uprisings at lower financial cost, but also lower political cost, because policing can be more preemptive, more community embedded, and develop greater public legitimacy. We had colonial policing here in the United States. The Texas Rangers were responsible for wiping out the indigenous population and pushing out Mexican landowners to make way for white settlement. We also had policing used to manage the new industrial working class in London in the 1820s, but also in places like Pennsylvania at the turn of the last century, where the first state police force is created to manage the strikes of miners and industrial workers in a way that local police weren't able to. So they created a state police force modeled explicitly on the U.S. occupation of the Philippines. And then we have the use of slave patrols, not just in the rural countryside, but in urban areas like Charleston and New Orleans and Savannah, where slaves actually worked outside of the home of their owners in wharves and warehouses, and they needed a force to manage that mobile slave population. So I would argue that the Charleston City Watch and Guard in the late 1700s is actually the first real professional, uniformed, 24-hour police force. But we never hear about that example in the liberal descriptions, because it's seen so clearly that it was about a system of racialized oppression. So I think we need to understand policing as a tool to manage regimes of accumulation and exploitation that generate resistance that has to be managed. And today, rather than slave...
Let me ask that. Yeah. That was slightly academic speak there for a second. So I mean, in layman's terms, that last part was they're protecting wealth from people who don't have access to the wealth.
And they're protecting systems of exploiting people. You know, so it's not just the property, it's the relationships of exploitation. And today, we don't have like colonialism and slavery in the same way, but we have a system of mass unemployment and underemployment, mass homelessness, mass untreated mental illness, huge levels of participation in black market activities because people don't have access to real jobs. And that's what policing do today, is they manage those consequences of these economic systems of exploitation that we have today.
Yeah, and I mean, that seems particularly clear in this city in Baltimore, where we have high unemployment. It's a hyper-segregated city, and I think for a lot of white people like me, that only became clear after something like the death of Freddie Gray, when it became, the mask kind of came off, and it was very obvious that police were there to protect the power structure and to protect the white property from the propertyless and the jobless and from minority populations. And yeah, that was also the time when these calls for it seems like more police surveillance, body cameras came out, and we just had officers charged with recreating discoveries where they planted drugs, and so they're using the body cameras for their own to their own advantage now, rather than the things that people were calling for. So, I mean, you do go through. It's not just attacking the sort of progressive or pseudo-progressive police reform, but you also go through some solutions and some alternatives that may work a little bit better. But one thing people are calling for a lot these days is disband the BPD here in Baltimore. And other cities are saying that. When you're saying the end of police, do you think that we should and could get rid of the modern police force as we know it altogether?
What I'm saying is that you show me a problem that communities are suffering from, problems around drugs, problems around youth violence, problems around homelessness, and I can show you ways that we can address those problems without policing. Now, if there are problems that we can't figure out how else to address except to have some coercive state force involved, well, then so be it. Let's deal with that. But the vast majority of what police do today is manage young people with few opportunities, homeless people out on the street, people having a mental health crisis, and we know how to manage those problems without using police.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you mention mental health problems, it seems like that's one of the places that, I mean, I forget the figure you have in the book, but a huge number of civilian encounters that police have are people who are dealing with mental health crises. But then if we look at self-medication, that a lot of the drug policing may also be from self-medicating for mental health issues. And yet Thomas Allers, the sergeant in the gun trace task force here who pleaded guilty last week, one of his defenses or requests for lenience was that he was dealing with PTSD, that he was dealing with, and so it seems like we've created this system where we have people who are sometimes armed, who are dealing with mental health crises, who are confronted by people who are always armed, who are also dealing with trauma and mental health crises. And that seems like an impossible situation. What are ways that we can help people? You have some good examples of ways that we can deal with these mental health crises better than sending someone out. And because we've all heard of the cases where you call 911 on your own son because he's going through a crisis and he ends up dead that night.
Yeah. In fact, between 1.25% of all people killed by police are having a mental health crisis at the time they're killed. And yes, some of them may be armed and some of them may be trying to commit suicide by cop, but this just points out the utter ludicrousy of the system that we have of sending armed police when someone's in crisis. So what could we do instead? I mean, we need to build a robust mental health structure. In the 1960s and 70s, we dismantled a deeply problematic state hospital system. And in a lot of places, we were told that the money that was saved from that would be invested in community-based services that would allow people to live independently with dignity and take care of themselves. But that investment never happened. It went to tax cuts to the rich or more policing services. And so we need to start by building that infrastructure first so that people don't reach crisis stages where there needs to be an intervention, and also so that there are people who can respond who have actual mental health services to offer, not guns and handcuffs to deal with that. And I think you've linked this to the behavior of police and also violence in the community, and what ties those together is this issue of trauma, which is largely unaddressed throughout our medical systems and throughout our communities. Almost every single young person who's involved in violence has been a victim of violence. They have been shot. Their brother has been shot. They have seen their one parent beat up the other parent. And those traumas are never addressed. So now we see the police, they also experience trauma, and the police at least are being offered some services to deal with their traumas, to reduce absenteeism and to have them be less anxiety prone on the job. But really, these whole communities need access to culturally appropriate trauma services, that's not only going to reduce the mental health calls, it's going to reduce the cycle of violence that's driving a lot of the problems we have with policing.
Yeah, I want to come back and talk about the role of police in schools in the second part of our conversation. So maybe this is a good place to wrap up. The first part, Alex Vitale is a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and the author of The End of Policing, and we'll be back for a second interview, so stay tuned. I like that guy's book. It was a good book, but it was frustrating to read because the general terms, and here in Baltimore, I feel like policing is such a peculiar thing that we've been dealing with on such a, and you know, I gotta say, I didn't really recognize it until the uprising after Freddie Gray because it's designed for me being white here to not recognize it. Growing up in South Carolina, having long hair, they're like, "Oh, you're a fag," and I recognized it. But here, it was designed for me not to see.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been out in the streets the past few days talking to people and just kind of trying to get a feel for what people want covered and what people want to hear from their news and stuff. And I had a conversation with a lady the other day, and I was just kind of running off some of the things that we cover, and I said the word police reform, and she stopped me, and it surprised me because she stopped me and she was like, "Well, what you talking about when you mean police reform?" And she went in and she was like, because some people, when they talk about police reform, they're talking about more policing. And when some people talk about police reform, they're talking about tearing the whole thing down, you know what I mean, and restructuring it. And I thought that was interesting because I don't think a lot of people pick up on that the word reform is not just, it means different things for different sides of the discussion.
Yeah, it really does. And I think it has become this tricky thing that liberals are sort of being like, "Oh yeah, police reform," but that what it really does is put a new face of legitimacy on police in the way that I read a really interesting book a little while back called Ghetto Side, and it was about the homicide crisis similar to ours in LA, and it followed these two particular homicide detectives, and they're like, all this predictive policing and trying to stop crimes you don't stop crimes that way. What we need to do is solve the murders, and if we solve the murders, then we'll stop the murders. I feel like that really does have something to say here, that like, what are you gonna do if somebody kills, your friend, and they're not going to get caught, but who did it. They probably can come after you if something doesn't happen. And so what choice do we leave people? So it's an interesting book. It's got a lot of problems as well, I think, but it sort of tries to look at, like, one way to do police reform is just focus on solving the murders that happen, and then people see that, like, oh, law actually works. And when you see that law doesn't work, then why follow?
That's good job. Good piece, man.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. So one of the things we've been trying to do more that I'm really psyched about, and you've probably noticed this, Easy, but doing more of these multimedia pieces that have video. We have the new website, thanks Stephen Frank, and that can do this now. You may know that we are primarily a video site, but we had this ridiculous lack of capability with that, to where you had to have one slot where a video went, and then you had a transcript below that. Yes, it is 2018, and I'm saying those words. But now we have a site where you can actually put video where you would like it to be in the piece, and we're able to have a lot more capability with that. And so we have a couple pieces that sort of deal with that. One is mainly a print piece, so you're not going to see it on here, but go check it out. It's called Class Clowns. It's by our friend Erica Blunt-Denois, who's a really great writer, and this is a spectacular story about Frederick Douglass High School, and there's a comedian, Karagu Buta, who works there, who teaches a class called Class Clowns, where they analyze comedy. They take apart scripts of comedic movies. They take apart jokes and stand-up jokes to learn the skills of creative writing, and it's a spectacular story.
Yeah, it was Erica. I looked at this piece when she was working on it early, and it was really, I thought it was fascinating and a great idea. Karagu is a comedian that I know and I've seen before, and he's hilarious. So it was, I thought it was really dope to see him doing this at Frederick Douglass, you know, taking all the class clowns and putting them in one class, and then encouraging them to write, you know, and it's like a creative approach to education. I think is really dope.
Yeah, and I mean the way it starts, instead of fighting against where kids are as teenagers, it starts with they're talking about a script that they're working on where the kid who curses the most has a bomb attached to him that will blow up if he curses, and it's his struggle not to curse, and it's really it's a funny idea for a script, and it got this kid, it sort of harnessed his cursing rather than just trying to squash it all the time. And I feel like there's a lot to be said there. And so there's this other story that we're going to watch some bits of right now. It also is a print story, and these pieces though are embedded in it, and so it's 3 videos that you'll see together right here, and it's about a program that takes people from Baltimore City and helps them learn how to work in the biosciences, the biomedical industry, which is a really fast-growing industry, and often people without skills in that industry at all, or without training. One woman that you're going to hear, the last person that you hear, she was working in food service. She got pregnant, so she wasn't able to do her job in that anymore, became homeless, was trying to deal with having a child, raising a child, and got in this program and has now been working at Hopkins for the last 5 years. And then the other person is the granddaughter of Henrietta Lacks. And great-granddaughter of Henrietta Lacks, who the HeLa cells, which ended up creating the cure for the polio vaccine, went up into space to test what happens to human cells in space. They put them by the radiation when they were testing nuclear bombs. All kinds of stuff have come from this, and the family got nothing out of it. And she tells this amazing story about how, as a kid, she thought that Hopkins was the bogeyman, that if you were out after dark, that Johns Hopkins would kidnap you
and take you and do
experiments
on you. Yeah, my mother talked about those rumors too.
And with her family, that was kind of true. That when her great-grandmother had cancer, they took the cells and they. So we're going to follow through these 3 parts. We're going to get an introduction to the program, and then we're going to get a conversation with 2 of the different people. And this is really a great story that I'm excited to have more and more writers coming into. And this is Kenneth Breckenridge, and I know his byline has his middle name, and I'm forgetting it right now, damn it, because I just know him as Kenny mostly. But Kenneth Breckenridge is a really excellent writer. If you're looking to hire writers to do pieces, he did some spectacular pieces for City Paper, and he's been doing some really great stuff here. And we went out with him. And Will Arenas went out with us from here and shot these interviews and edited them, and they look really beautiful as well. So check this out.
Hi, my name is Dr. Tim Fawcett, and I'm here at the Biotechnical Institute of Maryland, and I'm the scientific director, and I'd like to show you around. This is our facility here for our nonprofit, the Biotechnical Institute of Maryland, and this is our core mission, and what we do is we train individuals from Baltimore City to be entry-level lab technicians and support them in developing careers. This room, we train about 25 people per class. We usually have about 2 classes per year, and you can see that we have some sophisticated equipment, and what we do is we teach people in the latest technologies in biotechnology in order for them to get good jobs and be productive and have great careers that they love. Here we have all kinds of equipment, bacterial incubators. We have microscopes, all the different types of microscopes, fluorescent microscopes, phase contrast microscopes. We have centrifuges. We have all the technology that's important in modern biotechnology. If you come on in here, this is an equipment room. This is a -80 freezer that's at -80 degrees centigrade. It's a very special freezer for freezing biological samples and keeping them fresh. It's about 5 or 6 times colder than your standard household freezer. We have autoclaves, ice makers. We have to make crushed ice because crushed ice allows for better sample protection as opposed to cubed ice. We have special refrigerators. Here I'm growing some cells to clone a gene to be used in training, and so this is a shaking incubator. If you look down here, This is for shaking and growing bacteria at 37 degrees. It's an essential part of our biotechnology. Another thing we do here at the Biotechnical Institute of Maryland is we also have a for-profit venture called BioSci Concepts, and what we do is we have about 15 or 16 3- to 5-day courses in molecular biology and cell culture, and those courses are offered to paying customers who are professionals in the industry, and they come here and they spend some days with us and they advance their skills and learn the latest technologies such as real-time PCR, cell culture, and a number of other important technologies. Here we have photo documentation. The interesting thing about these sciences is everything is expensive. We need a lot of money to support the instrumentation. Here we have UV light boxes that allow us to visualize DNA on gels. I'll give you an example of that. So here's some examples of gel electrophoresis on an instrument, running DNA molecules and separate them according to size. These are typical things that we teach our students in our nonprofit course. One of the interesting things is that all the equipment and all the things that we use here in this room, in these workshops, also are applied to our students. So as I learn new technologies to support the workshop program, those technologies and lessons are also given to our students in our nonprofit Biotechnical Institute of Maryland.
In the culinary field, being pregnant, I mean, first of all, being a woman is difficult already. You're already undermined, and then being pregnant, you're a liability. You're not an asset. And then becoming a mother is just even more of a liability, even though they don't tell you that. You're really not a desired employee. So after having my son, it was kind of difficult. So I was just really in between a rock and a hard place. I was homeless with my son and, you know, just trying to figure out what my next move was. I really wasn't getting hired. I'd never gone without employment as long as I did. So I said, you know what, I'm either gonna go to school or I gotta get a job. I have to do something. Something has to give. One of the supervisors would come down sometimes and he pulled me to the side. He says, is this what you wanna do? I said, no. And I said, I'm willing to learn. I just need a chance. I just need to know where to go. So he pulled me into his office. He gave me a sheet of paper. He said, go to this address. It's like a job fair. He said, you know, you might be able to find something. Why don't you just go there? I did. I looked around. I looked around again. And there was a gentleman. I asked him what information he had. He gave me 3 sheets of paper, and he said, this is a list of free programs, free training programs going on in the city. On the first page, the first mention was BTI. Maybe like a 3 or 4 line description of what the program was. I looked at it and said, I can't do that. And just went on to the next program. And I sat and I thought about it, and I said, how can you teach your son to apply himself if you don't apply? We had people from all walks of life. You know, you had people coming from out of retirement. You had people that were doing complete career changes. There were maybe like 1 or 2 other people that had living situation issues. And so the common factor was that we were all here and we were all doing something that we hadn't done before. And there was this wall. Everyone had this defense that is kind of a lot of programs, not all, but many programs will make you feel that there's 20 of you, there's 2 spots. Go for it. And not with BTI. They just said, listen, you determine how far you go. We believe in you and we know you can take it as far as you want to. We're just the launch pad. And we grew to learn each other and encourage each other. And in that nucleus, we were able to then help each other grow even more than what we thought we could. So it was an awesome experience.
My great-grandmother is Henrietta Lacks. She was the lady whose cells were taken without the family permission from Hopkins that end up coming up with the cure for polio in vitro fertilization. Countless medical discoveries and research advancing science by 60 plus years.
Henrietta Lacks was forgotten by science, but her cells were about to become world famous. For the first time, anything could be tested on living human cells. Her cells were sent into space, accompanied by 2 white mice. The aim was to find out what would happen to human flesh in zero gravity. Cosmetic companies bought millions of her cells to test for possible side effects in their new products. The American military placed large flasks of HeLa cells next to atomic tests. They wanted to see what the effects of radiation would be on human tissue. And then came polio. HeLa cells were the perfect host on which to grow and study the polio virus. From this came the development of the vaccine that conquered the disease.
I represent my family on the National Institution of Health. I also do speak for Precision Medicine Initiative, the Moonshot Initiative, and countless other boards that I didn't volunteer to be on. Well, Precision Medicine Initiative came about when President Obama was in the White House. He started in about 2013, and I was honored to be able to be at the White House when he launched the initiative. At that time, I didn't know like what part I would play in it, but I was so excited and I knew I wanted to be part of it.
The key to all this is for us to be able to build up databases, and because all of us potentially could have electronic medical records that voluntarily, with strong privacy protections, we pool together so that researchers, practitioners, scientists can share. We may be able to accelerate the process of discovering cures in ways that we've never seen before.
But with my family history with research, I still had some trust issues and some things to get over. So I sat there and I was like, I want to be part of this. And then I realized, and I was like, well, what part would I play? And I realized what he was talking about and the research that they wanted to do was part of my family story and legacy. And I needed to use what my family had already built and added to it to continue research in medicine because it's very important. It was a lot of challenges here. And I learned that anything worth having is worth fighting hard for and working hard for. And you learned that through the guidance of the staff because they never let you give up on yourself or anything that you're doing. So it was a challenge. It was a challenge getting here on time. It was a challenge, you know, just trying to keep the grades up. It was a challenge balancing your personal life, but they made those challenges seem obsolete, like things that was just nothing, like you can get through this. And then before we looked up, it was over, and then I found myself like sad, like now we gotta leave. Like you don't want to leave your staff, you don't want to leave the friends you made here, and it's just like a sad time because you really fall in love with here.
Man, I feel particularly corny saying that this is the future, having these multimedia pieces, because that was like 2007 future. But for us, I really think that I've finally been hitting the idea that we're not just writing for, you know, like I come from City Paper and stuff, for a piece of square paper. Yeah. Or we're not just making a video for a square YouTube frame, like we've done here a lot, that we're all making the internet. And that in doing that, we're able to break those old boundaries that are still sticking in our minds. And like this, we're simultaneously making a podcast and a show, and we're showing these other things. And like the possibilities at you know, a nonprofit that takes no government funding, no corporate funding, anything like that. Like The Real News is we really have a lot of opportunity to break free of what we all think of that we're producing and produce new kinds of stories. And this is one way that you get that story that Kenny did, just multiple levels of storytelling.
Yeah, man, the possibilities are endless. I'm glad to see us exploring them.
What else? What else do we have this week?
So we mentioned at the top of the show that Dharna did a piece on the Ellicott City flood that happened last weekend. And shout out to Dharna Noor. She worked over the weekend covering this. I think did an excellent job. It's pretty heartbreaking to see what happened out there, but I think she ties this into climate change, right? This is like her piece is talking about pretty much why this happened and how this came about, right?
Yeah, I mean, so it's both climate change and overdevelopment at the same time. And, you know, because and the rain tax, I mean, this falls squarely on Hogan, who ran against the rain tax.
If you don't know, Larry Hogan is the governor, Republican governor of Maryland. Like Baynard said, ran against the rain tax,
which he said was taxing rain, but what it was taxing impervious surfaces that doesn't allow water to soak in, and to mitigate the things like Ellicott City being down in a valley and this water come rushing in like that. And I'm going to read just the lead of her story because it's such a really nice story, and you know, it's also a memorial to Eddie Herman, who was the National Guardsman who died trying to save someone in that. Recovery workers found Eddie Herman's body in the Patapsco River on Tuesday afternoon. The 39-year-old National Guardsman died after saving Cape Bowman from a flood in Ellicott City over Memorial Day weekend. I can only hope I would have done the same thing, said Max Robinson, an Ellicott City resident and a friend of Bowman who was also caught in the flood. Even if he wasn't sure that he would have acted as heroically, he knew he could have met the same fate, just trying to move his car. When Robinson left his apartment on Ellicott City's Main Street, the murky brown rainwater was up to his ankles. He stopped to talk to a neighbor and then to help a vision-impaired man to his apartment. Despite the water rushing around his legs, he held an umbrella over his head. Within minutes, the water was up to his waist. I love that image of a dude walking through waist-high water holding an umbrella. That's like our response to climate change, exactly. Like that's the perfect image of how we're responding to these problems, I think.
Yeah.
You know, and much appreciation to Max for really like being willing to talk about this, and because it really is. I mean, he lost everything. And then he spent his time talking to Dharna. We're gonna have a lot of stuff. So it's a month away from the election.
Yep.
As we're coming up, we're gonna have a lot of stuff about the election some more. Next week, I should have a couple explainers on the state's attorney's race that are going to be talking about what that is, what it means to be state's attorney, where that race is. You've heard from each of the candidates on this podcast so far. Marilyn Mosby, the incumbent, Ivan Bates, one challenger, and Thiru Vignaraja, another challenger, whose sister is also running for governor. And we're going to hear from gubernatorial candidates as well, and really have some focus on election issues to help you know who to vote for. Many people have said, I have no idea who to vote for state's attorney. I don't either.
Yeah, me either.
But I do know what issues are at stake and what's at play. So we want to try to help you with that kind of stuff. So keep following along at the Baltimore Bureau. And there's another story that isn't a Baltimore story, but I wanted to shout out before we give our other shout outs that Easy did this week with Will Arenas about a new movement of sit-ins.
Yeah, the new sit-ins. I talked to attorney Gerald Griggs, who is with the NAACP and down in Atlanta, and a part of the movement they're doing right now, protesting Waffle Houses. There have been several violent incidents with police officers at Waffle Houses where the victims have been charged, charges pressed against them from Waffle House. In one situation, even the mayor spoke in support of law enforcement and Waffle House. So that piece, shout out to Will Arenas, did a great job putting the images in there and everything. But it was a good conversation I had with Attorney Gerald Griggs. I think we'll have him on tomorrow too and follow that.
Yeah, he was really good, and also shout out to Will on bringing that story to us. Really,
yeah, because it was Will that actually pitched it and even wrote the script.
And not only pitched, but kept pushing us. Hey guys, we're going to do this story. And too often there's a lot of people who do like a ton of hard work here that's behind the scenes. And so like you see us but But the people who are doing that often like have much more to do with the story than you would even imagine than just filming or whatever. And so, yeah, a real shout out to Will on that. Man. As always, to David Hebden, our audio producer, to
Dave.
Stephen Frank, our engineer.
Yes, Stephen.
And this week, instead of Dwayne Gladden doing our video production, it is Chris DeMilo. Yep. So thank you, Chris. Shout out to everyone else who helps this stuff happen and get out there here at The Real News. James, who does the social media. If you saw this via Twitter or something, then you owe James Daly a thanks for that. James and I went and saw Willie Nelson this last week down at the Anthem in D.C. And man, that place is really, I think we should take a field trip down there next month or so.
Yeah, we looked at some of the shows coming up. I definitely want to go check it out.
Yeah, I forgot what we were going to go see down there, but it's a crazy venue.
Special shout out to David Jaber. I hope I'm saying your last name right. He emailed us. If you like the Baltimore Bureau podcast, you have feedback, feel free to email any of us, Baynard@therealnews.com, Easy@therealnews.com, and Dharna when she's usually here, Dharna@therealnews.com. We appreciate all your feedback. We also appreciate your money. We are a nonprofit. We don't take any corporate money, do any advertising, so donate and we can keep this thing going.
And you ought to since she's away and stuff, it would be funny if Dharna got back to like 100 emails saying, hey, you need to really be on there. This Sausage Fest shit sucks. So why don't you send those emails to Dharna, and it'll be a good way for her to come back from what is sure to be a stressful trip to New York City.